I'm going to preach this morning on the parable of the Good Samaritan, and I want to do some cultural stuff to unpack this lesson a little bit so you can get access to it a little better. It says an expert of the law or a lawyer stood up, and expert of the law was what my translation says, and it's a better translation, but this, don't think somebody who has an office down on Main Street who goes to court to try cases. These were men who were experts in the Torah, in the law of Moses. And they were experts in settling legal cases. They did that on occasion. But more often than not, they just decided how Jews should live and what the Torah actually said about what they could eat, what they couldn't eat, what they could do, what they couldn't do, and things such as that. So it's not a lawyer in our modern sense of the word. The hero of the second half of the parable is a Samaritan. And 2 weeks ago, I had you use your imagination. I'm going to do it again. If you're looking at Palestine, in the north was Galilee, and it was bounded by the Sea of Galilee, which is a big lake, and the Mediterranean, and below it was inhabited mostly by Jews, and below it was Samaria, that were inhabited by Samaritans who were not Jews, and below it was Judah and Jerusalem, and that was inherited entirely by Jews except for the Romans that were occupying it. And the Samaritans and the Jews hated each other. The hatred went back centuries because of race, and the Jews considered the Samaritans to be half-breeds for reasons I'm not going to go into. And they worshiped on Mount Gerizim instead of in Jerusalem, and the Jews thought it was false worship. And they thought it was such false worship that when the Jews were in control of all of Palestine prior to the coming of the Romans, they went and destroyed the Samaritan temple in Mount Gerizim. And the Samaritans, for their part, retaliated by throwing human bones in the temple in Jerusalem and defiled it. And that does not make for happy relationships. And Jesus, when you think of Jesus, we often think of him as a modern teacher, a philosopher, and I think that's the wrong way to think of him. Think of him as an ancient sage. And the culture was a culture of exaggeration. It's still, the Middle Eastern culture still is a culture of exaggeration. Exaggeration, things are turned on its head, and that's what Jesus is doing today by making the Samaritan the hero. As for the priest and the Levite, the priest was a man who was responsible for the worship of God in the temple in Jerusalem and the sacrifices. And the sacrifices were what kept everything working. They believed that it pleased God. It allowed them to be fertile, allowed their lands to be fertile. And the job of priest was paramount in the people of Israel. The Levites were the helpers in the temple, and they too were of great importance, and their job was of great importance. And the problem they had, they didn't just walk by because they didn't care. The problem they had is there was something called corpse pollution. And you couldn't tell from a distance whether this guy was alive or dead, and for any Jew to touch a corpse of a human being made them unclean. For a certain number of days, and then they had to wash and make a sacrifice, and then they were clean again. For a priest to touch a corpse meant that they couldn't function as priests. And it meant all that went on in the temple came to a halt. For a Levite to touch a corpse was to mean that they could not function as a Levite anymore, and all their work came to a halt. So they had perfectly good religious reasons for not going over to check and see if this guy was still alive. The Samaritan, on the other hand, does the right thing. He goes, he helps him, he bandages him, he ministers to his wounds, he takes him to an inn, and he gives 2 denarii. A denarii was a day's wage, 2 denarii to the innkeeper, and he says, when I come back, I'll pay whatever else I owe you. And he's the hero. He's the one that does the right thing. He shows mercy. And mercy is one of the tantamount things that Jesus calls us to. Mercy for those who are less fortunate than us, for those who are broken, for those who are fallen, for those who are on the side of the road beaten by robbers. Several things are important to note from this passage. You can be too religious to show mercy. I'll say that again. You can be too religious to show mercy. If you're wrapped up in your religion to the point where it makes you right and makes you just and makes you important, then the odds are you are not going to be willing easily to show mercy. And it's true for both the priest and the Levite. Better for them to have lost their functioning in the temple and helped this man, because somebody else would have stepped in for them, than to walk by on the other side of the road. Self-assertion, trying to justify himself, as the lawyer is always the enemy of mercy. We either build ourselves up or we build up others, but we don't do both very well. And mercy is the opposite of self-assertion and ego. Mercy can be costly. 2 days' wage was not an insignificant amount of money for this man to lay down to the innkeeper and provide for this man to be cared for. And he promised even more when he came back. And are we willing to let go of our stuff, our wealth, our money, to care for those less fortunate than us and to show mercy? Because we as a culture are the wealthiest culture that's ever lived. And it is strangling us if we're not careful. All our stuff, all our wealth, our portfolios, they keep us from acting with mercy and kindness and justice very often. It's also risky. The Samaritan didn't know how much he would have to pay when he came back. It could have been a large amount of money. It all depended on how badly this guy was hurt. So it takes risk to be merciful. Finally, one last thing that's hidden in this passage is that's not there readily seen by modern viewers, unless you imagine this in your mind and you've been there. But the road from Jerusalem, which was of a higher elevation than Jericho, the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was a precipitous drop in elevation through a foreboding desert until you get to Jericho, and then the desert opens up into an oasis in Jericho. And it was a road known for robbers and brigands. And this man who is set upon by robbers and brigands is on the road by himself, which he should have known better than to do. It was his own darn fault. And we're called to show mercy on people even if it's their own darn fault. Too often, we assume people deserve what they get and don't show mercy. But that's not how mercy works for Christians. Christians show mercy even when someone has brought on themselves their plight. Self-assertion, mercy. Which do you choose to live in today?